My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
For the longest time, all I knew about Attica was it was a thing you'd see people in prison in cartoons and the like yell as they rattled a metal cup or some other object against the bars of their cell. Why they did this, I had no idea. It was a reference to something that I really knew nothing about. Yet the story of Attica and the prison riot/rebellion that took place there is anything but silly and inconsequential. It was an event that saw 39 people killed by state police as they retook the Attica State Prison, which had been partially taken over by prisoners following an unplanned spontaneous riot. Among those killed by the officers' gunfire were 29 inmates and 10 hostages, while an additional 89 others were wounded. Yet as bad as this scene was, it was not the end of the story, as following this deadly assault by state police, the surviving prisoners were brutalized and quite frankly tortured. All of this, though, the reason why so many died in the assault and what happened to the prisoners afterward was effectively covered up, because the governor who had ordered the violent retaking of the prison rather than continuing negotiations, and the state police who were responsible for the subsequent violence and death, were the ones effectively guiding the investigation. Indeed, despite numerous witnesses to what happened in Attica, not a single police officer, prison guard, or state official has ever been convicted for the events of the 13th of September 1971. Yet, before I go any further detailing the events in Attica and how they came to be, first, like always, I want to reference my sources for this series, which primarily are Heather Ann Thompson's excellent Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and its Legacy, and Malcolm Bell's The Attica Turkey Shoot, Carnage, Cover-Up, and the Pursuit of Justice. And like always, these sources and the various articles that I used to put this series together will be listed on this podcast Twitter page and Ko-fi page, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. To truly understand what happened in Attica, you have to realize that the Attica Uprising was by no means the first of its kind in New York State. Indeed, in the year preceding the events in Attica, prisoners in New York City's jails, including the infamous Tombs and the Queens Branch House of Detention, rebelled multiple times. These uprisings, as you might expect, were not some random spur-of-the-moment type thing. Instead, they were the product of the massive overcrowding of the city's jails, which was itself largely due to the country's new so-called war on crime. To give you an idea of how bad this overcrowding was, you have to realize that in 1969, the year before the New York City jail rebellions, there were 13,000 people jailed in a system that had been designed to hold less than 8,000 individuals. 3 to 4 men then were commonly stuffed in the cells meant to only hold 2 individuals at most. Worse still, 84% of those being held in these jails had not even been convicted of a crime. They were just there because they could not afford bail, and so they were left waiting there for a court system that did not seem to be in any hurry to hear their case. This was a system then that had been set up to fail, especially when you consider that to maintain order in these crowded jails full of 13,000 agitated inmates, there were 2,400 overwhelmed guards. In response to this situation and the deplorable conditions in these jails, in May of 1970, the men held on the 9th floor of New York's infamous Tombs came together to form a group called the Inmates Liberation Front. Believing that education was crucial to organizing, Victor Martinez, a member of the Puerto Rican street gang turned humanitarian and civil rights organization the Young Lords, was a key figure fostering the group's prisoner education workshops. These were meetings designed to educate and recruit their fellow prisoners that took place in locations like in the showers or in some place like the last cell on the floor, so as to try and keep things secret from the guards. Sometimes these meetings would even take place a little more out in the open, but in doing so, they made it look like they were playing cards, so the guards wouldn't be suspicious when they passed by. The reality was, though, those taking part in these meetings were actually discussing things like political science or analyzing the brutality of the penal system and the ways they might challenge it. The prisoners who then took part in these discussions came to agree that to accomplish anything, they needed unity across the different racial groups. which was going to be tough, but as they spoke, they also came to realize that as prisoners, they had been denied their basic human rights, and with that, any potential solidarity they might have felt with the guards vanished, as they instead started feeling more connected with their fellow inmates. These boiling issues then came to a head on the 10th of August, when on the 9th floor of the tomb's 225 men captured 5 guards and locked them in their cells. The prisoners then kicked out the panes of bulletproof glass in the windows, and through these holes tossed handwritten messages down to the streets below. Messages that read things like, quote, "The people are tired of being treated like animals in this hell. I might die from the beat-up, but it's worth it." News then quickly spread about what was happening in the tombs, which soon led to a loud meeting between the rebellious inmates and George McGrath, the New York City Commissioner of Corrections, during which time the rebels listed their numerous grievances, which included excessive bail, sham hearings, and restricted access to law books. They also complained about moldy and rotten food, lack of clothing provisions, and about the filthy conditions. Most notably, they complained about how the jail was, quote, "ridden with bloody lice, roaches, rats, and mice." Then there were the guards who were especially violent when it came to Black and Puerto Rican prisoners, concerns which tied into the substandard medical care in the jail, that included the tomb's physicians covering up this racially inspired violence by submitting false accident reports. This wasn't the full extent of the guards' bad behavior either, as the prisoners also complained about how the wives, sisters, and mothers of inmates were, quote, "insulted and indecently proposed to by the officers of Tombs Prison." All of which was, according to the rebels, clearly not the result of a few bad apples, as it would write, quote, "not one leaf of a tree could turn yellow without the silent knowledge and consent of the tree itself," meaning that this rot wasn't isolated but a part of the system, as everyone working in and around the prison knew what was happening and did nothing to stop it. As a result, the rebels' final demand was for the administration to promise to ensure that the guards did not seek physical reprisals for the rebellion. It was then after receiving this promise from Commissioner McGrath that after 8 hours the rebels released their hostages unharmed. This, however, was far from the end of the New York City jail rebellions, as the very next day 800 prisoners on the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 8th floors all rebelled, capturing 3 hostages while tossing burning trash and dead rats through broken windows down to the city streets below. This time around, though, the prisoners would refuse to release the hostages until after the administration promised to investigate the terrible conditions of the tombs. Commissioner McGrath would again make a promise to the rebels, and as a result, the hostages would be released unharmed. The thing was, even with the hostages released and Commissioner McGrath leading the public to believe that the Department of Corrections was back in complete control of the facility, the fact was the rebels actually for 10 days would continue to control the 4th floor of the tombs, during which time they conducted a boycott of the court system, so that only a small fraction of the inmates set to go to court actually appeared before a judge. Finally, though, on the 20th of August, 80 men were sent in to retake the tombs by force, at which point Victor Martinez and others who had been identified as leaders of the rebellion were transferred to the Queen's branch of detention, where, since nothing had actually been done about the underlying conditions that had led to the rebellion in the tombs, another rebellion would take place on the 1st of October. At which point 100 inmates were being transferred to the mess hall, captured 7 guards, who they then put in cells, while they went on to let loose the other 396 individuals also held in the Queen's branch. This included 9 members of the so-called Panther 21, which I covered in more detail in, I believe, the Jimi Hendrix series of all things. With all the inmates now let loose, they wrecked the facility, smashing the plumbing, destroying phones and kitchen equipment, while also setting fire to the chapel. Indeed, the only place that was left untouched was the prison's library. It wasn't all chaos and destruction, though, as the inmates made sure to barricade the entry points to the jail while establishing their own guard post. They also took the time to elect their own committee of representatives, which included 3 Black Panthers and Victor Martinez of the Young Lords. These representatives then requested and were given the opportunity to speak to the public in a press conference that was attended by roughly 100 journalists, Commissioner McGrath, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, and the former Bronx Borough President Herman Badillo, a name that will come into play later with Attica. In this press conference, the rebellious inmates brought to light the terrible conditions in the jails as I've already outlined, the rampant court delays that were extending the stay of those who could not afford bail, as well as other issues like how Muslims were not allowed to practice their religion and the need for more Spanish-speaking staff members to better communicate with the Spanish-speaking prisoners. Meanwhile, round about the same time this was happening in the Queen's branch, the prisoners in the tombs were rebelling yet again. This time it was the prisoners on the 11th floor who took 25 jail workers hostage. These inmates then formed their own revolutionary committee, which then expressed solidarity and support for the statements and demands that had been made by those rebelling in the Queens Branch House of Detention. These weren't the end of the uprisings either, as at 9 p.m. that night, 900 inmates at the Kew Gardens Branch also rose up. While these particular prisoners took no hostages, they still managed to take complete control of that particular facility. Then, the following afternoon, yet another 1,500 inmates took over the Brooklyn House of Detention, taking 3 more hostages in the process. Meanwhile, as all of this was happening, protesters were gathering outside some of these locations in support of the rebellions, adding their voices to those demanding change. It was then in response to this widening situation and the threats of violence coming from the Queens Branch prisoners that 3 state Supreme Court justices gathered to review a series of 47 bail cases that had been specifically chosen by the inmates. Time and again then, as they reviewed these cases, the judges ruled that New York City's courts had been setting excessive bails. In fact, these judges even went so far as to declare that 13 inmates should be released immediately. One inmate, for example, who had been given a $3,500 bail for possessing stolen property, had his bail dropped to nothing and released. Meanwhile, 4 others would have their bail reduced to $25 each, an amount that was promptly raised by the supporters outside so that the men in question were freed. Now, the judges would only actually review 15 of the cases set before them before departing. Yet, still this success led the rebels to renege on their promise to release all the hostages, as they instead chose to release just 2 as a sign of good faith. Doing so likely planning on prolonging their holdout, but Mayor John Lindsay and Commissioner McGrath were tired of the situation and opted to just retake the jails by force, as they utilized the combined forces of hundreds of guards, cops, vigilantes, and various wannabes to retake each of the jails one by one. These forces and a combination of tear gas and hand-to-hand combat led first to the retaking of the Brooklyn House of Detention and the Kew Garden Jail. A process that, while brutal, did not result in any fatalities, in notable contrast to the events at Attica that would happen a year later, with the authorities focusing on retaking these locations first, as the inmates there had not had as much time to fortify their positions as those in Queens and in the Tombs had. When it came to the Tombs, the authorities gave the prisoners an ultimatum to either release the hostages or face, quote, other courses of action. In addition to these implicit threats, when the warden of the Tombs addressed the rebels, he managed to drive wedges in between the various factions among the inmates. With the once unified coalition now splintering, a number of inmates who hadn't really been a part of the revolutionary action demanded that the others release the hostages and surrender. From there, the authorities turned their attention to the Queens Branch, where some of the most dedicated rebels were preparing for war. Yet how much, if any, consideration was given to actually harming the hostages as a part of these efforts is questionable, as at no point had any of the rebels during these various uprisings killed or even seriously injured any of the guards. In fact, many of the hostages would state that they were treated quite well. Indeed, according to Daniel Zeman, quote, they did for us better than we do for them. Finally, by a narrow vote, the prisoners in the Queens Branch decided to surrender and release the hostages. Surrendering, though, did not prevent violent reprisals by the guards retaking the jail, as prisoners and reporters alike witnessed guards savagely beating the prisoners with clubs, knocking multiple individuals unconscious while others stood by watching and laughing. In addition to these violent reprisals, which would continue well after the jails were retaken, ultimately 39 inmates would be indicted on various charges stemming from the rebellion. This treatment of the rebels by the state would be seen again, and would play a role in the events in Attica. However, it does have to be pointed out that all of these jail uprisings were ended without fatalities, something which, as I've stated, will not be the case in Attica. Crucially, in addition to these violent reprisals, the state officials after ending these uprisings did not seem to be all that interested in reform, or at least not meaningful reform. You see, they would really only address one of the prisoners' major complaints, and that was the issue of overcrowding. The problem was they did so simply by moving the problem around. You see, one of their main solutions to the overcrowding problem in New York City's jails was to take a number of the prisoners involved and ship them to the prisons upstate, effectively creating the same problem there. Yet, this time the problem was more out of sight, a move akin to those characters in cartoons who just sweep dirt under a rug. They haven't really cleaned or gotten rid of the issue, they're just kind of hiding it for a time, until, of course, the pile of dirt becomes so high it's impossible to miss. which is essentially what's going to happen here, as the New York State and prison officials shifted their problem upstate under a rug until the rug in question couldn't hide their problems anymore. In fact, Attica wouldn't even be the first upstate prison in New York that would have a prisoner rebellion following the events in New York City. Instead, the problems would first manifest in the Auburn Correction Facility, which had been the site of the country's first execution.